Hello and welcome to this presentation on crime scene management. The presentation itself takes the format of a PowerPoint show rather than a PowerPoint presentation. The only real difference is the presentation will have the look and feel of a video rather than a traditional PowerPoint presentation. If you need to pause the presentation at any stage, you need to click your right mouse button. To restart the presentation, you need to click your left mouse button. If you need to start the current slide at the beginning, you need to click backspace. And then if you click enter, the current slide will restart from the beginning. We will be looking at crime scene management and forensics, and in particular the practical application of forensics at scenes that you'll be attending every day of your working life. If you have any problems, don't hesitate to contact teaching staff who will be able to help you with any issues you may have. If there are any accompanying documents with this presentation, they will be made available to you before the presentation starts. Okay, so this is a strange photograph to have in a presentation on forensics. But what I want you to consider is the proximity of the dancers. How close are they together? How much contact is there between the two dancers? Is there a possibility of a transfer of hair and fibres from one dancer to another? If this is the case, then think about this. If the boy then goes and dances with a second girl, could there not be a transfer of hair and fibres from girl number one to girl number two via the boy without girl number one or girl number two ever meeting each other? This is called secondary transfer. Just an important principle for you to understand about forensics. French scientist Edmond Locard theorised the principles of secondary exchange, where he suggested that every contact leaves a trace. If this is the case, it would explain the reason why fibres and trace evidence from girl number one managed to get onto the clothes of girl number two even though they've never met. However, opponents of Locard suggested that this might not be the case and asked the question, does every contact leave a trace? Because sometimes we don't find it. So Edmond Locard expanded his theory to include when a trace is not located, it isn't that the trace hasn't been left, it's merely our inability to locate it. How small is forensics? Well, this is a scanning electron microscope image of a dressmaker's pin. Think about how small a dressmaker's pin is. Can you see the piece of glass on the head of that dressmaker's pin? How many people can see the other 3 pieces of glass? Think then about piece of glass number 4. That would not be visible to a naked eye. And if that was airborne with other particles the same size, it would appear as a fog or a gas. How fragile then is piece of glass number 4 and indeed the other 3? How easy is it to lose that or to damage it or to change its appearance? You simply walking into a room can affect it. Turning lights on, opening windows and doors can create drafts and move forensic evidence of that size very easily indeed. You can tread on that. You can move it by moving other items inside the scene. Yet that can be proven evidence. We're now going to see a short video clip made by the University of Central Lancashire on backward fragmentation. The video shows a man with a hammer smashing a car window. There is a problem, however, in that all glass is manufactured by float glass these days, and as such is not forensically unique. What that means is any fragment of glass from a suspect's garment cannot be matched to a specific window. So what's the point in using glass as evidence these days? What I'm going to ask you to consider is that every one of you will have fragments of float glass stuck to the underside of the soles of your shoes, those shoes that you walk outside with. And the reason for this is float glass is everywhere outside. It's on our pavements, on our streets, in our shops, and to a certain degree in our own homes. So finding float glass on the underside of a suspect's shoes is not really going to be of any forensic use. But I'll ask you to consider, let's say we find float glass on the suspect's lower leg area from ankle to knee. Is that more evidence than on the underside of the sole? Well, it is slightly, because that doesn't traditionally come into contact with the road surface or a pavement surface, so it cannot be easily explained away. If we then extend that to the suspect's knee to hip area and we find float glass there, is that more value than between ankle to knee area? Well, yes, it is, because it's even less likely to come into contact with the road surfaces. So if we push that a little bit further, hip to shoulders, then it becomes even more valuable. And if we take that to the extreme, shoulders to the top of the head, it is very unlikely that float glass gets in somebody's head, hair, beard, ears, without being close to or in close proximity to a window as it's being broken. So in this particular example, it's not the forensic value of the glass that forms the evidence. It's the position of the glass on the suspect that strengthens the evidence, and the higher up the suspect the float glass is found, the stronger the evidence. Just want to talk to you a little bit about forensic work that takes place within the West Midlands Police, and in particular at the scene. The first group of people I want to introduce to you is the FSIs, and this is forensic scene investigators. These are the people that will attend your crime scene and search for evidence. If they locate any, this will be recovered and processed for you at a later date. Sometimes our FSIs need to become coordinators. The reason for this is if your scene becomes complicated, there may need to be a stepped approach to forensic recovery, and this will need coordinating. All FSIs are trained photographers, but remember, you have photographic equipment yourself. You're all wearing body-worn cameras and you all have devices with cameras on them. You are encouraged to take photographs at crime scenes, but please only use police equipment and not your own. Footwear evidence can potentially be extremely strong evidence and needs to be treated with great care at crime scenes. Generally, FSIs will recover footwear from crime scenes, but occasionally we bring in experts to develop crime scene marks so they can be seen more clearly. Blood pattern analysis is a science that helps scientists predict and make interpretations as to the sequence of events inside your crime scene. Imaging and 3D mapping takes place at scenes such as road traffic collisions. The imaging and 3D mapping is constructed so that it can be reproduced later on in court. The search and collection of CCTV will play an important part of your investigation in the future. CCTV coverage of the West Midlands and the country as a whole is generally very good and often supplies very good and strong evidence of a sequence of events. Digital forensics includes the search for telephones, computers, images, memory sticks and such things as routers. The recovery of forensics takes place at crime scenes, usually with FSIs, but occasionally specialists are brought in to recover specialist items. So if we now look at away from the scene, I just want to introduce you to fingerprint identification, and the people that do that are our fingerprint experts. They're based at Ridgepoint House, which is the forensic headquarters in Ward End, Birmingham. And what they do is they receive the fingerprints recovered by FSIs and they make attempts to match them to known records. Occasionally the fingerprints are not of sufficient quality to do much with. So under certain circumstances, there's various processes by which fingerprints can be enhanced. This takes place at Ridgepoint House also. Body fluid search includes the searching of body fluids and microscopic body fluids like sprays of blood, maybe some saliva, maybe even semen and other types of body fluids on clothing and footwear. This can take place at Ridgepoint House because they have a DNA clean laboratory. Likewise with DNA recovery, this goes along with body fluid searching. This takes place in the DNA clean laboratory, so the courts can be satisfied that the work taken place has been clean and complies with ISO. Any digital forensics that's recovered from the scene is examined and analysed actually at Ridgepoint House, again in Ward End, Birmingham. This is where the specialists recovery team work on digital recoveries. And this might be messages or images on telephones or computers. It may be enhancing things like recordings that can be used in court at a later date. Similarly with the imaging and the 3D mapping, the people that analyse and produce the imaging and 3D mapping that's recovered at the scene are actually based at Ridgepoint House away from the scene. Any CCTV that you do recover needs to be processed by the specialist team at Ridgepoint House so they can produce the evidence for you. This is a long wait, sometimes up to 3 months, to recover CCTV evidence. They will produce the evidence that goes to court often. They will also enhance any images that may be able to help you in the identification of suspects. Our forensic submissions, such as items being sent away for DNA and any comparisons between fibres, doesn't actually take place in the West Midlands Police. We have a forensic partner called Eurofins that does all our forensic work for us. So any comparison or blood work or ballistics work actually takes place away from the West Midlands Police altogether. The last one is NABIS. That stands for National Ballistics Intelligence Service. Now they are an intelligence service and they don't actually do the forensic submissions for ballistics comparison. What they actually do is they look at the recoveries, the ballistics recoveries from crime scenes around the country, and they try and establish to see if firearms are being used in different positions around the country. Okay, just want you to think for a little while about examples of physical evidence. Have a think about it and write down as many examples as you can think of, and we'll give you a few moments to write that down and we'll come back to you. Okay, is that long enough? How many of those did you get? Okay, what we've done is we've split them into 3 columns: items, biological and marks. So if you go back to items and we look at the top one, weapons. A weapon can be anything. It can be an ashtray, it can be a stick, it could be an iron bar, it could be a plank of wood. Anything can be used as a weapon. Tools, and when we talk about tools, I'm thinking maybe a burglar's tools such as screwdrivers, hammers, jemmies, chisels and things like that, or anything that may have been used to commit an offence. Firearms we talked about earlier on. Firearms are left at scenes, but very, very rarely. Displaced furniture, that might be, for example, at a fire scene where a carpet is fire damaged and the chair has been protecting the carpet from the fire. So when we actually arrive, we see some nice undamaged area of the carpet. That tells us that that chair's been moved after the fire had been put out. So there might be legitimate reasons for this. It might be that the chair's been moved during the firefighting process, either by firefighters or by the firefighters' hose. Paperwork and letters. So maybe you're dealing with a fraud case and you might need examples of bank statements or maybe some legal letters. Or there might be images, inappropriate images, or even envelopes that's been ripped open by offenders that we could potentially get fingerprints from. It says bullets there, but really speaking, I'm thinking of ballistics more than anything. And ballistics in terms of spent bullet cartridge cases and the actual bullet themselves. So those go off to NABIS, as in the previous slide, for them to do their intelligence work before the analysis takes place. Vehicle is a very common item to be recovered. Often vehicles are stolen and recovered, or maybe used in crime. In those instances, those items are recovered. Smoking items, and I'm not thinking just of the smoked cigarette end, but also have a think about the disposable lighters that you get with a little flywheel that you have to spin around to light the lighter. That's a very good area to trap DNA, and often we get some good results from that type of item. So if we go over to biological, blood, semen, hair, tissue, I'm talking about human tissue and not Andrex. So blood, semen and hair regularly recovered from crime scenes, and occasionally human tissue too, will all hold a potential for strong DNA recovery. When we use the term spit, spit hasn't actually got any nucleus to the cells, so there's no DNA in spit. So when we hear that spit's been recovered from saliva on maybe a cigarette end, it's not actually the saliva that's the DNA is coming from, it's actually the buccal cells. And the buccal cells are the cells that cover the inside of the cheeks inside your mouth. We don't usually recover urine from crime scenes, but occasionally we recover urine from post-mortems. Faeces we only recover in extreme circumstances, maybe major scenes, and there's a couple of reasons for that really. Firstly, the recovery of faeces represents a significant health and safety issue. And secondly, we've got to think about the people who are going to be responsible for storing these items afterwards and how much they would like you bringing back bags of turds for them to store. Vomit is a very strange substance and quite acidic, so often that destroys the evidence that you're looking for in the first place. If you're looking for blood maybe, or identifying who'd vomited, often the DNA is long since gone because of the acidic nature of vomit. Also, if you're looking for evidence of any recently consumed meals, the acid has possibly part processed that, and it makes it very difficult to actually see what the contents are. When we go over to marks, marks are a very strong area of evidence, and the top one there is fingerprints, and clearly fingerprints are one of the strongest types of evidence that you can get. But also tyre tracks and footprints are exactly the same. So the way that works is individual marks on the tyre tracks and the footprints made by stones and little bits of glass and little bits of metal make the tyre tracks and the footprints completely unique, making these very good evidence. Palm sole prints. The ridges on the palms and the soles of your feet are as unique as the ridges on fingerprints, so this makes this very good evidence as well. Tool marks. Tools are actually manufactured by machines, and these machines leave unique marks on the tools. So when that tool's used, say for forcing a window open at a burglary, often those unique marks can be left on the window, making this really good evidence to recover. Ballistics too leaves good evidence in the respect that anything that we've recovered in the way of bullets and ballistics items from the items column can be looked at in terms of what marks are on those. So as similar with the tool marks, there's items that happen mechanically to a bullet when it's fired. A firing pin, for instance, actually physically fires the bullet. The bullet travels down the inside of a gun with a rifle barrel, and that can be matched occasionally to the firearm that's fired it. If we're finding spent cartridge cases at a crime scene, then the way that cartridge case has been ejected is a mechanical process, and that mechanical process can leave unique marks on the cartridge case. Blood distribution is a very important tool that's used by scientists, and it can give them information that help them interpret the sequence of events inside your crime scene. Impact damage is where two items come together in a mechanical way, and the same with other items in this column. Anything that happens in a mechanical way has the potential to be unique. On the left, if we have a look at this forensic work and we think about major crime, what kind of scenes do we think fall under the major crime banner? So I'm just going to put a few up now. Unsurprisingly, these are the ones that you might think would fall under major crime. Things like murder, aggravated burglary, armed robbery, kidnap, wounding, rape, those sorts of things, all feature under major crime. And you may ask yourself that for a little while you probably won't be involved in these sorts of things, and that would be absolutely right, but I want to come back to that. Left hand side. Okay, so if we look at volume crime, I'll just pop a few of these up. Nothing particularly surprising there in the volume crime list. Residential burglary, criminal damage, commercial burglary, minor assaults, auto crime, etc. But just because something's been labelled volume crime doesn't mean to say it's not going to drag you into something more serious. And I'll give you an example. My forensic team a few years ago were involved in a murder inquiry, and the murder inquiry consisted of a burglar breaking into a residential house and being discovered by the elderly occupant. The offender then hit the elderly occupant on the head, and she fell down the stairs and later died in hospital. My team went to the scene to investigate and recovered considerable amounts of evidence, none of which particularly identified a suspect or an offender. So we handed the investigation over to CID. CID concluded all their lines of inquiry, and like us, they too hadn't identified specifically a suspect or an offender. So what can the CID do at that stage? Well, if you think about it, the original offence was a residential burglary. So it's not unsurprising that CID now want to investigate all the previous residential burglaries in that area for the previous 6 months. And guess what? That included some of the scenes that you attended. Volume crime may appear on the surface of it to be volume crime, but it has a nasty habit of dragging you into something more serious, because now your investigation at that burglary that you attended 5 months ago is now part of a murder inquiry. I just want to talk a little bit about scene attendance policy, and this is a policy that's signed off by the Chief Constable, and as you can see, it's an attendance directive. This is an attempt to manage resources when we have far more need than we have resources to send. So sometimes when you ask for FSI to attend your scene, they're not allowed to based on this policy. And a perfect example of that would be theft from motor vehicles, where the forensic evidence recovery is traditionally very, very low indeed. However, some of these vehicles occasionally have things like blood or footprints or items left by offenders, and in those circumstances FSI still will attend. But please don't be too frustrated when they don't attend to certain scenes because it's directed and they're not allowed to attend. We see a lot of the scene preservation. In this next section of crime scene preservation, we're going to be looking at contact between offender and location. It's not difficult to imagine that there's a regular contact between offender and the floor via the feet. After all, offenders don't hover into scenes. I want to introduce you to a concept called common approach path, or should that be uncommon approach path? We'll be looking at what you need to be looking for inside the scene, how to preserve that kind of evidence, and what FSI can do with that. Okay, like I said, we're going to look at this small case study. This is a burglary of the building at a local small supermarket type shop. The offenders have broken the glass in the front door, probably using the brick, although that could have been used by the shop to prop the door open. So that's a question you need to pose to the people that work at the shop. The glass has fallen inside and is on the floor and can be plainly seen. This represents some forensic opportunities for us. Firstly, the glass represents some opportunity because the offender's going to have to crawl over that area. Secondly, any time you're dealing with broken glass, there is potential for blood to be found at the scene. Any blood that you see needs to be preserved. Also, one of the things that the shop workers want to do is open up so they're not losing money for a length of time. So you're going to be under pressure to allow people back into that shop. So how do we do that with all that glass all over the shop door area? One of the things you can do, carefully move the brick, looking to see if there's any blood on that, is that you can fold that glass into that carpet or that little mat area. Then that can be lifted easily and safely to another location so the shopkeeper can actually open up the shop and start earning money. Okay, this is the inside of the shop and this is the door from the previous shot. What the offender has done is he's crawled through the door and walked across the shop, and he's gone behind the counter where he's stolen some cigarettes, some scratch cards, and a few other bits and bobs. What I want you to think about is the fact that this area is a public area. It's a shop. People are allowed to be in here. So it's not unreasonable to expect that there are going to be footprints on the floor. There are going to be fingerprints on surfaces. This is of very little evidential value. But think about how the offender has moved through the shop and behind the counter. Then it might be that you want to try and use a different route to get a look behind the counter. You may decide that this is a better route for you to move around the shop where you're not destroying evidence. There's another little section just in front of the counter and to the side of the counter. Again, not really that much use in terms of evidence because it's still a public area, but it's better than the green area. So what about this red area here where the offender must have walked to steal the items that he stole? This is a very good area because it's got no public access. So this is an area where FSIs will concentrate a lot of the work regarding the recovery of footwear evidence. So if you've used the green area, you've preserved that area and you've reduced the amount of damage you've caused by walking in and out of the shop. The FSI examined the floor behind the counter and recovered these 5 footwear impressions. Sadly, all 5 were that of the police officer. As a police officer, you have to consider, do I really need to go behind the counter? This is the most valuable area of floor, remember. This is an area where there is no legitimate access. Could I have conducted my investigation without walking in this area? If the answer's no, and you do have to walk in this area, how could I have walked in that area without damaging the footprints of the offender on the floor? Sadly, one of these footwear impressions struck straight through what they think is probably going to be the offender's footwear impression and destroyed it. So please, if you don't have to go into this area, don't go into that area. The evidence there is very valuable and it's very easy to destroy it. Okay, so I just want you to think a little bit about what a fingerprint is. Can I ask you to look at your hands and you'll see that there are ridges all over your hands and fingers. It's true also of the soles of your feet and your toes. The ridges are there purely to aid grip, but they're very useful for us, obviously, because the ridges are unique to you. So the material that's left behind is sweat, generally speaking, moisture, fatty acids and debris that the body's getting rid of. So how do we preserve fingerprint evidence? I want you to think about being at home in your kitchen and then imagine that you take a pot of honey out and you dip a pen in the honey and sign your signature on the kitchen work surface. Then imagine that you get some cornflakes and you crunch the cornflakes into dust and scatter that over the honey signature. What you're left with is a beautiful honey signature in cornflakes. But if you then put gloves on and handle that area, do you really think you are not going to damage that signature? And that's exactly the same as what happens with fingerprints. Fingerprints are exceptionally fragile and can be easily damaged. And you can't preserve fingerprints purely by putting gloves on. You have to handle things in an entirely different way to what you used to. This is what we describe as an untidy search at a domestic burglary. The offenders have taken the drawers out of cupboards and emptied them on the bed so they can see what the contents are very quickly. So normally this would be cleaned up before the FSI arrives at the scene. But a few years ago I attended a burglary like this when the scene looked like this when I arrived. And I asked the elderly occupant why she hadn't cleaned up, and she said the police officer had told her not to touch anything. And subsequently she spent the evening in an armchair downstairs. What we could have done, knowing that fingerprints are best found on smooth shiny surfaces, glass jars, shiny tins, jewellery boxes, sides of drawers, etc., then all the clothes and other items that weren't suitable could have been put away. The items that were suitable could have been put to one side to wait for the FSI's arrival. Remember, handling items in the same way as an offender might handle them may destroy evidence. So rather like the common approach path, we have to handle things in a slightly different way to normal. However, you could have moved the drawers and the shiny items over to one side by holding them at the very edges. This would preserve evidence without damaging any fingerprint detail. When attending the scene of a burglary, one of the key areas is the point of entry. This is evidence rich for FSIs. You must consider preserving this area very well. This is one of the first things that you need to establish when you attend the scene, so that area can be preserved first. If glass is broken at the scene, this is a very important piece of evidence for FSIs. First thing to look at is to try and establish if you can account for all the glass that has been removed from the window. Sometimes you see the available glass that's on the floor on the inside and the outside, and you think that would never fill that gap in the window. This might mean that you're missing a piece of glass, and often offenders will pull glass out of windows and throw it over their heads. Sometimes this lands on the garden, in the grass, in bushes, on shed roofs, etc. But this is a very important piece of evidence, because if an offender's handled this, he's handled that glass in a way that could never be handled normally, in that there will be a thumb on one side and probably 2 or maybe 3 fingers on the other. This can never be done before the window was broken, so this piece of evidence is very valuable indeed. So it's worth spending a few moments searching the garden to try and find it. Sometimes you may have to climb in a window because an offender's locked the front door and the victim can't get into their house. Before you actually start climbing in, please be careful and be aware of any evidence that's been left by an offender. As you can see from the photograph on the right hand side, things like footprints hold enormous amounts of value. Care must be taken when you're climbing in a window not to destroy this evidence, so try and climb in a different way to what you think the offender may well have done. Just take a few moments to think about what evidence we can get from blood. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, the obvious one is DNA. You can get DNA from blood, certainly from the white blood cells you can get DNA. But did you know that scenes can be interpreted with regards to the distribution of blood within the scene? People with the right skills will be able to advise you on the sequence of events, maybe even the number of strokes, the level of violence used, and the locations of attack. This is a representation of a bloodstain on a vertical wall. What can we say about this bloodstain? Well, firstly, it appears to be travelling in a direction, and the direction it's travelling in is that direction. And the reason why I know that is because the little spot on the right hand side of the bloodstain, and that's created when a bloodstain hits a wall and can't quite hang on to that last little bit of blood. So it flips over into a full stop or an exclamation mark the way you see it here. And that's always a good indicator as to which direction the blood is travelling. Also, the ellipse on the left hand side appears to be quite long. And the reason for this is the blood spot has hit the wall at an oblique angle. We can also say that because the blood is going uphill, then a force must have been applied to it. Otherwise, it would have just fallen to the floor with gravity. Now, clearly, a blood pattern expert will be able to say an awful lot more about your scene and the patterns of blood within it. But just purely from this simple examination, we've been able to establish direction, angle, and force. Any movement of any items inside the scene that's blood-stained could potentially confuse the interpretation. So please don't move any blood-stained items in a scene unless you've recorded their position and the position of the blood beforehand. This bloodstain was found by a police officer at the scene of a burglary dwelling house on the outside of a patio window. The police officer had been informed that FSI couldn't attend for a number of hours. As it looked like rain, the police officer was concerned that the rain would damage this evidence. What could the officer have done to preserve this evidence? In this particular case, the officer simply sellotaped a piece of plastic bag over the blood stain. It did in actual fact rain quite heavily, but because of the work in preserving the evidence that the officer did, the evidence wasn't lost and the FSI was able to recover it when they attended the scene. This is a great example of the police officer thinking outside the box to preserve evidence. This is a Rorschach or ink blot test. It's used in psychological testing to measure preconceived ideas. People are asked to look at the ink blots and to say what they see. So I'll give you a few seconds to have a look at it and have a think about what you can see. Some people can see poppies. Some people can see a battleship firing guns. Some people can see a face and a mask. Some people can see a lady standing in front of us. But there's nothing actually there other than ink blots. It's just our perceptions. The way an ink blot test is actually produced is a number of ink blots are put on a piece of paper and it's folded in half. And it reproduces on the other half of the paper. So I'd like you to bear that in mind for a moment. Consider this then. You've been asked to recover this from an incident. You can see on the left hand side, just underneath the logo, there's a wet blood stain. Thinking about Rorschach, how are we going to package this item? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. Okay, so if we just fold this item up, then we're going to suffer from Rorschach, aren't we? It's going to just reproduce that blood stain in the opposite side, facing the opposite direction if you fold it in half. So we know from earlier slides that blood can be interpreted, and blood on clothes often produces fantastic evidence at court. But it needs to be preserved and packaged well so as not to confuse the blood pattern analysis. So how do we package this item? If you lay a sheet of paper directly over the top of this garment and then roll it like a Swiss roll, no part of this garment will touch any other part of this garment. So the blood stains are not altered and the blood pattern analysis will not be confused. After you've rolled it into a long sausage roll, it can then be folded and put inside a normal paper bag. If you have a look at the blood stain on this shoe, this is my shoe. And I didn't offend the man that was lying on the pavement, officer. I just went over to help him. And when I went over to help him, he obviously bled on my trainer. Am I telling you the truth? Well, no, I'm not. You can see some of the stains underneath the laces have got directional spatter to them. So they're showing signs of force and direction. So it's far more likely that rather than helping the man, it was me that assaulted him by kicking him. So you can see that blood patterns can be very good evidence in proving what actually happened at the scene of the incident. And it also helped to prove that I was lying when I told you I'd only gone to help him. Inside the car. If you've asked FSI to go to a scene, anything they do or anything that they've found will be on a system called SOCWeb. You'll have access to this. Any evidence that they've recovered will be listed. Any notes they've made at the scene will also be listed. If they've taken photographs, you'll be able to view these photographs and download and print them. Generally speaking, for volume crime, West Midlands Police do not produce photographic albums, but they will allow you to download and print the images for photographic reference and use in your case. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact the teaching staff who will be able to assist you with any issues you may have. Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit now. We've located our items, now we're going to package them. But why do we need to package things? Okay, the first thing that we need to think of is packaging to protect items from damage or loss. We're thinking of fragile items, glass for instance, or complicated items with many moving parts like the cuckoo clock, or dangerous items like the bulleted cartridges. So we have a piece of blood-stained glass, and firstly the glass is sharp, so if we put glass into a plastic bag, it's just going to cut through the plastic bag and potentially injure somebody. So any container that glass needs to go into needs to be rigid in some way or other to prevent that from happening. Also, the glass is blood-stained, which is a biohazard, so we need to protect people from biohazards as well. So any container that this goes into must be able to achieve both. So what have we got here? It's a mobile phone. What are we preserving? Are we looking for fingerprints? Are we looking for DNA? This is certainly good surface for both of those items, but more often than not we're looking for digital information. Digital information stored inside devices like this is very difficult to preserve. And also, with the changing nature of digital evidence, the advice given can change from week to week. So potentially locking a change down to a particular period of time is very difficult. The advice of the West Midlands Police is to contact your local digital media investigator. Make sure you've got a contact details for them so you can ask for advice if you come across digital evidence that you need to preserve. Simply turning it off is not really an option because potentially you could be damaging digital evidence. Please contact your digital media investigator before you do anything. Clearly you don't need to recover biodegradable items such as this. Taking these items back to a police station and storing them for lengthy times is a potential health and safety issue. You can take photographs with your device or use your body-worn camera to record images to show what's been stolen. You can also make a written note of the items that's been stolen. You can ask the shop where they've been stolen from to run them through the till and give you a receipt as to the cost of the items that have been stolen, and you can use that receipt in evidence as well. Hugely expensive, delicate and fragile items like this need to be packaged in rigid containers. West Midlands Police will supply you with rigid containers and you need to use them to prevent these items from becoming damaged. The Chief Constable will not thank you if you ask to replace an item because it's become damaged through poor packaging. One of the key reasons for packaging is to prevent cross-contamination. Can you remember the dancers and how fibres were transferred from one area to another? Lockhardt's principle of secondary exchange says every contact leaves a trace. So when we're thinking about packaging, we must make sure that our package is sealed in such a way that nothing can get out and nothing can get in. That way the courts can be confident that the item that you've brought to court has not been cross-contaminated with other items. Another reason for packaging is that of health and safety. Remember your commitment to the Health and Safety at Work Act. Think about this. People have got to handle your items after you've packaged them, and they need to feel safe to be able to do that. So if you've been to a crime scene and recovered a knife and packaged it in a paper bag, and the knife has passed through the paper bag and injured somebody, that leaves you in trouble and the organisation vulnerable to being sued. Packaging also helps to maintain continuity and the chain of custody. Packaging is there to establish the integrity of the item that's seized for court. Courts can be confident that the item that's within the package is that that's been recovered from the crime scene some months earlier. The packaging also helps to show everybody who has handled that item from seizure to court, and they do that via a CJA label, which I'll talk about in a few moments. It's important that the package gives the criminal justice system confidence that the item is what it says it is. So details of the item that's contained within the package needs to be reproduced on the CJA label. It's important to note that the person who originally takes possession of the items is responsible for exhibiting it. Also, they're responsible for completing the CJA exhibit label. What that actually means is if you find an item, then the exhibit becomes yours. If a member of public comes up to you and says they found this item, then the exhibit has to be theirs. But you help them complete all the CJA labels, you do all the packaging, and you help them with writing a statement as to the recovery of the item. Anyone who opens, removes or transports the item must also sign the CJA label. So CJA stands for Criminal Justice Act, and that's the information that's needed on the evidence label, such as the integrity and the continuity of the item or chain of custody. A lot of the packaging these days are these self-seal evidence bags, which makes packaging a lot easier. So let's go and have a look at what information we need to put on our label. So the first thing it asks for is authority, and the authority is always West Midlands Police. We also need to give the item that's in the package an identification number. Some people call this exhibit number, but it's not an exhibit number. Only the courts issue items with exhibit numbers, not the police. So the exhibit number is usually made up of the finder's initials, then a slash, then we start at 01 for the first sample, 02 for the second, etc, etc. So in this particular case, the exhibit number is RS01. So we need a description of the item with a little bit more detail than just wallet. So there's not much room there to put an awful lot, but put enough information there to give a good description. Then we need to put the date and the time that the item was found and the location where it was found. And again, a little bit more detail if you can possibly do that. So the person seizing or finding is the person that puts their name there and signs it underneath. If you know the crime number or the incident number, then you can put it in the box underneath, but often you don't know that. So if we now look at the continuity, the person finding also needs to put their name, sign and date in this section to show that they were the first person to find it. As we said earlier on, Sometimes other people find the item. So it's other people that are producing, not yourself. So that person will need to sign it, put their name and sign it, and also give it their reference number, not yours. Because that's the first person handling this item, they will have to put their details in the first box. Because they then hand it to you, you then need to put that in the second box to show you were the second person to handle it. And then any subsequent people that handle it from there on, they will need to put their name and sign it as well. It's really important to get the detail on the exhibit labels as accurate as you possibly can. This is a legal document and it will be examined in great detail in court for mistakes. Sometimes the CJA labels are literally card labels. It asks the same sort of questions. And on the reverse, you can see that it deals with the continuity of the item, so where people can sign and say they've handled or moved that particular item. Again, it's really important that you're accurate with the details that you put on this. This is a legal document and it will be scrutinised at court. So please be very careful to put the correct information down. In order to make sure your packaging conforms to good practice for court, and to make sure that you establish that nothing can get out and nothing can get in, this is the way that you can seal a normal paper bag. So if you fold the edges over in a way that you do with an envelope until you've got this sort of situation. Then make sure that you apply sellotape to the seals to make sure the sellotape goes all over the seals and there's no area where there's not sellotape covering the seal. At that stage, you need to sign directly across the seal onto the sellotape and onto the bag. And what this does is this establishes that this is your seal. So when you get handed this item in court and they say this is your item, did anybody open it? You can say these are my seals and they're still intact. Any exhibit label that you need to attach to it needs to be sealed in exactly the same way, sellotaped to the bag and signed across. This will establish the continuity and the integrity of the item at the same time. So we can show to the courts that nothing has got in and nothing has got out of this package. This is an example of how we package sharp items like a bloodstained knife. The photograph on the left hand side shows the bloodstained knife and underneath it shows an extendable knife tube. The knife tube's made of polythene, but the end caps are of hard plastic. That makes it very difficult for the point of the knife to pass through. If we look at the photograph on the right hand side, further health and safety measures have been taken by the person packaging it, as they have noticed that there's blood on the shaft of the knife, so they have attached caution health hazard tape to the package. In this particular example, they've used a CJA card label to attach to the knife tube. This is filled in the way we showed you earlier. Another way of doing this is the whole knife tube could be put inside a self-seal bag and the CJA part of that bag can be filled in exactly the same way. The key point here is the fact that the knife is perfectly safe inside the knife tube. People can handle that item confident that they're not going to be cut by the knife. Just want to talk about packaging good practice. If we look at the top one, package all items separately, this means if you have a pair of shoes, you can't put them in the same bag. And the reason for this is we don't want to allow the courts the opportunity to consider that one shoe contaminated the other. All exhibits or CJA labels must be on the outside of the packaging, and this enables anybody that handles or moves the item to be able to sign the continuity section of the label. All packaging must be sealed to a point where nothing can get in the package, but nothing can get out either. We always use tape and never staples because staples will create a breach in the package. All hazards must be marked as such. If you think back to the knife tube from the previous shot, the person packaging that item had noticed some blood or potential blood on the blade. So when they packaged it, they put health hazard tape on there to alert anybody else that's handling that item that it potentially has health hazards. We always use appropriate packaging material. So if you think about the knife, we used a knife tube to make sure that nobody got injured. If we were packaging an item of glass, we'd do exactly the same and make sure the glass was packaged in a rigid container. If we think to the expensive item, the reason why we're packaging that is because we need to protect it from damage. So rigid containers need to be used in that instance. Any wet items should be dried before packaging in brown paper bags, and we'll show you how you dry items in the next slide. If you're recovering fluids in a bottle, please make sure that the bottle tops are secure prior to packaging, because we don't want leakage ruining packaging and potentially damaging evidence. Forensic drying cabinets are available at various sites around the force. To find out where your nearest available forensic drying cabinet is, you need to contact Ridgepoint House Forensic Services Headquarters. They will tell you which cabinet is available and where that is. Officers need to place wet items of bloodstained clothing in to enable it to be forensically dried. This needs to be done in a way that we can prove that there's no contamination occurred. Only items that require further examination will need to be placed in these forensic drying cabinets. A forensic drying cabinet is a way that we can forensically dry items from crime scenes safely. There is a very strict cleaning and recording process with regards to the use of forensic drying cabinets. Items can take 48 hours to dry, and then they're packed in brown paper bags afterwards. It's your responsibility to put the items into the cabinet and to enter them into the DP system, but the FSI will remove the items and clean the cabinet for you once the items are now dry. Items from only one source can go into a drying cabinet at any one time to avoid cross-contamination. And don't forget, all exhibits must be booked into the detained property system. This is a strict recording system to establish and give the courts confidence that the cabinet is clean when your items have gone in, and the cabinet has been cleaned once your items have been removed, so they can prove that it's safe to use for the next thing that needs to go in. Just a quick recap on packaging and storing of items. Clothing, that includes clothing that is previously wet, bloodstained and dried, can be stored in brown paper bags and dry stored. This is perfectly satisfactory in preserving DNA and that type of evidence for court purposes. The reason why it goes in brown paper and not polythene is brown paper allows the item to breathe. If the bloodstained item goes into polythene, you will get a build-up of bacteria on the blood, and eventually it will completely consume the item if left long enough. Knives, screwdrivers, chisels, we've seen the knife tubes with metal inserts, or the ones we saw were of hard plastic. These can be dry stored in the detained property because we've prevented anybody from being injured by packaging them correctly. Any fragile items need to be in rigid or padded containers. Think about any damage that we cause to these items we could potentially be liable for afterwards. Any questions, please don't hesitate to contact the teaching staff. They will be able to help you with any issues you might have regarding forensic packaging. Yet surprisingly, more seems to be coming back towards the offender. This can be explained by Newton's third law of motion, that of reciprocal action, in that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Well, this is great for us because we know offenders break glass. And if offenders break glass, there is a potential for them to be covered with shards and fragments of glass the size of piece of glass number 4 from one of our previous slides.